A millionaire decides to disguise himself as a driver. His goal was to get to know his fiancée's family better. However, what he discovers changes his life forever. His fiancée's family had much more than just a secret. Before you hear this story, remember to subscribe to the channel. The rising sun gilded the skyscrapers of New York City as Richard Mercer adjusted the worn baseball cap over his carefully disheveled hair. He observed his reflection in the rearview mirror of the rental car, a basic model quite different from his collection of luxury vehicles. His usually impeccable hands now sported fake calluses and deliberately unkempt nails. The perfectly tailored Italian suit had given way to a faded plaid shirt and worn jeans. Richard took a deep breath, feeling his heart race. In a few minutes, he would be face to face with the family of Elizabeth, his fiancée, but not as the successful millionaire businessman he really was. Today, he would be just Charlie, a simple rideshare driver. The idea had come after months of Elizabeth's evasiveness about her family. The brilliant and ambitious young architect spoke little about her past. When asked, she would deflect with a sad smile or change the subject. The mystery only increased Richard's curiosity and concern. "It's complicated," Elizabeth would often say, her brown eyes clouded by a shadow that Richard couldn't decipher. "My family, they're different. I don't know if they would understand. Our world." It was these words that led him to devise this bold plan. If Elizabeth couldn't or wouldn't formally introduce him, he would find a way to meet them on his own. The perfect opportunity arose when Elizabeth mentioned that her parents needed a driver for a series of appointments throughout the week. Richard pulled the cell phone from his pocket, rereading the message he had sent to Elizabeth the night before. "Honey, a last-minute business trip came up. I'll be away for a few days. Don't worry, I'll call whenever I can." Guilt gnawed at him for a moment, but he pushed the feeling aside. He was doing this for them, for the future they were planning together. He drove through the streets of Brooklyn, observing the fabric stores and garment factories that were beginning to open their doors. According to the information he had gathered, Elizabeth's family had lived there for generations, owners of a small artisanal rug company. He parked in front of an old brownstone, its well-preserved facade contrasting with the modern buildings around it. A discreet sign announced, "Thompson Rugs, tradition since 1950. Richard checked the address once more, making sure he was in the right place. With one last glance at his reflection, he got out of the car and walked to the door. His hands were sweating when he rang the doorbell. The seconds seemed to drag, on until he heard footsteps approaching from the other side. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with graying hair and penetrating eyes. Richard immediately recognized Anthony Thompson, Elizabeth's father, from the few photos she kept in her apartment. Yes, Anthony's voice was deep and authoritative. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the man's appraising gaze upon him. It was now or never. "Good morning, sir. My name is Charlie. I'm the driver you hired for this week." Anthony frowned, studying Richard. For a few moments that seemed like an eternity. Finally, his face softened a bit. "Ah, yes, come in." Richard took a step inside the house, feeling as if he were crossing not just a threshold, but entering a completely new and unknown world. The interior was surprisingly spacious, decorated with an eclectic mix of antique furniture and modern pieces. On the walls, elaborate tapestries competed for space with contemporary paintings. "Wait here," Anthony ordered, leaving Richard alone. In the entrance hall as he disappeared down a hallway. Richard took the moment to observe the environment. His business-trained eyes couldn't help but notice the signs of wealth subtly scattered throughout the house. The crystal chandelier on the ceiling, the carefully arranged art objects, the aroma of an expensive perfume that lingered in the air. For a family supposedly owning a small rug company, the Thompsons seemed to be living very well. Muffled voices reached his ears, coming from a nearby room. He recognized Anthony's deep voice, but there was another, younger and more agitated. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was clearly one of argument. Before he could reflect on what he was hearing, Anthony reappeared, accompanied by a young man whom Richard assumed to be Ryan, Elizabeth's brother. The resemblance between the two was notable. The same intense brown eyes, the same determined chin. But while Elizabeth's gaze had always been warm and welcoming, Ryan's eyes were cold and calculating. "This is my son, Ryan," Anthony introduced. "He will give you the details of this week's appointments." Ryan stepped forward, extending his hand in a handshake that was too firm to be friendly. "Nice to meet you, Charlie. I hope you're prepared for a busy week." Richard returned the handshake, maintaining his humble posture. "Certainly, sir. I'm here to help in any way I can." Ryan smiled, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "Great. Let's start with a trip to downtown. We have some deliveries to make." The tone with which Ryan pronounced the word deliveries made Richard wonder if there was more to this rug business than met the eye. But he pushed the suspicion aside, focusing on his role. "Of course, sir, the car is ready in front of the house." As they headed for the exit, the kitchen door opened, and Richard felt his heart leap. There stood Hannah Thompson, Elizabeth's mother. The resemblance between mother and daughter was striking, although the years had left their marks on Hannah's face. Her eyes, however, carried a sadness that Richard had never seen in Elizabeth. "Who's this?" Hannah asked, her gaze alternating between her husband and son. "The new driver, Mom," Ryan answered impatiently. "Remember, we talked about this yesterday." Hannah nodded slowly, her eyes fixing on Richard with a disturbing intensity. For a moment, he feared being recognized, but soon realized that her look was of a different nature, as if she was seeing a ghost. "Nice to meet you, Mom," Richard hastened to say, averting his gaze. Hannah didn't respond, just continued to stare at him as Anthony gently guided her back to the kitchen. "Come on, dear. You need to rest." As they left the house towards the car, Richard couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The family dynamics were strange, laden with unspoken secrets and meaningful glances. What exactly was Elizabeth hiding about her family? As he started the car, with Ryan in the passenger seat giving brusque instructions, Richard found himself diving deeper into a mystery that promised to be much bigger than he had ever imagined. The week ahead would be crucial to unraveling the secrets of the Thompsons and perhaps understanding better the woman he loved. What Richard didn't know was that each mile traveled would bring him closer to a truth that would change his life forever. A truth buried in the subtext of the Thompson family history, in uncomfortable silences and furtive glances. A truth that, once revealed, could not be ignored. As he drove through the busy streets of New York City, Richard wondered, how far would he be willing to go to discover the truth? And more importantly, would he be prepared for the consequences that would come with it? The traffic light turned green, and Richard accelerated, carrying with him not only Ryan, but also the weight of secrets that were beginning to unravel like the threads of an intricate and mysterious rug. The chaotic traffic of New York City snaked around the car, where Richard, disguised as the driver Charlie, was conducting Ryan Thompson through the streets of downtown. The silence inside the vehicle was broken only by the occasional dry instructions Ryan issued, indicating changes of direction or stopping places. Richard kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was working incessantly, processing every detail, every nuance of Ryan's behavior. The young man exuded an aura of tension and mistrust that seemed to permeate the air around him. After about 20 minutes of travel, Ryan ordered them to stop in front of an anonymous-looking commercial building. "Wait here," he said, quickly getting out of the car with a leather briefcase firmly grasped under his arm. Richard watched through the rearview mirror as Ryan disappeared into the building. The minutes dragged on, and he took the opportunity to reflect on the morning's events. Hannah Thompson's reaction upon seeing him still intrigued him. That look. It was as if she had seen a ghost. But why? His thoughts were interrupted when Ryan emerged from the building, now without the briefcase, but with a brown envelope in his hands. As he entered the car, Richard noticed a subtle change in his posture. He was more relaxed, almost satisfied. "Next stop," Ryan announced, providing another address. The day continued at this pace, with Ryan making stops at various locations, some in upscale neighborhoods, others in more modest areas of the city. At each location, the pattern repeated itself. Ryan would enter with a folder or envelope and exit with another, or sometimes empty-handed. It was during one of these stops, at a warehouse in the eastern part of the city, that something unusual happened. Ryan took longer than usual, and Richard, driven by curiosity, decided to risk a closer look. He got out of the car under the pretext of checking a tire and discreetly approached one of the warehouse windows. What he saw left him perplexed. In the dimly lit interior, Ryan was animatedly conversing with two rough-looking men. On an improvised table, he saw something that definitely wasn't rugs. They appeared to be documents, many documents, being exchanged for wads of cash. Richard quickly returned to the car, his mind buzzing with questions. What kind of business was the Thompson family really running? And how did Elizabeth fit into all of this? When Ryan returned, Richard noticed a change in his demeanor. There was a glint of triumph in his eyes, mixed with something else. Anxiety, perhaps. "Change of plans," Ryan abruptly announced. "We're going back home." During the journey back, Richard noticed that Ryan was making frequent calls, speaking in codes that made no sense for a rug business. "The order has been delivered," he would say, or "the package is secure." As they arrived back at the Thompson residence, Richard was surprised by an unexpected scene. Elizabeth was there, standing at the door of the house, her face a mask of worry and confusion. Richard's heart raced. Being discovered now would ruin the entire plan, but to his relief, Elizabeth didn't seem to recognize him in his disguise. Her eyes passed over him without a second glance, focused entirely on Ryan. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tense. "Mom is agitated, saying things that don't make sense." Ryan shot a warning look at his sister. "It's nothing, Liz. Mom's just having one of her bad days." Elizabeth didn't seem convinced. She mentioned something about a face from the past, and Dad's been locked in his office since early morning. Richard observed the interaction, pretending to be busy arranging something in the car. The mention of the face from the past intrigued him. Could it be possible that Hannah had recognized him somehow? "Enough, Elizabeth," Ryan cut her off, his voice cold. "This is not the place to discuss this." He cast a meaningful look in Richard's direction. Elizabeth seemed to notice the supposed driver's presence for the first time. Their eyes met briefly, and Richard saw a mixture of emotions there: sadness, fear, and something else, something he couldn't decipher. "Sorry," she murmured, more to Richard than to her brother. "I didn't mean to cause any embarrassment." Richard nodded politely, fighting against the urge to go to her, to reveal everything and embrace her. Seeing Elizabeth there, clearly disturbed, tested his resolve to maintain the disguise. Ryan dismissed Richard for the day, informing him that his services would be needed again in the morning. As he walked away, Richard couldn't help but notice how Ryan practically dragged Elizabeth into the house, their voices rising in a muffled argument as soon as the door closed. That night, staying at a modest hotel nearby, Richard reflected on the day's events. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form, but the picture was still far from clear. Ryan's suspicious behavior, Hannah's strange reactions, the evident family tension. It all pointed to something much bigger and potentially dangerous. Lying on the hotel bed, Richard took out his personal cell phone, the one Elizabeth knew. There were several messages from her, expressing concern about not being able to reach him. With a heavy heart, he replied briefly, maintaining the facade of the business trip. "Everything's fine, honey. Long day of meetings. How are you?" The response came almost instantly. "I'm worried, Richard. Something strange is happening with my family. I wish you were here." Richard felt a lump in his throat. The guilt of deceiving her mixed with the growing certainty that he was doing the right thing. Something dark was hanging over the Thompson family, and he was determined to find out what it was. "I'll be back soon," he replied. "Stay calm. Everything will be all right." As he typed these words, Richard wondered if he could really keep that promise. Whatever he was about to discover had the potential to change everything, not just for him and Elizabeth, but for the entire Thompson family. Putting the phone aside, Richard closed his eyes, but sleep was slow to come. His mind replayed the day's events, seeking connections, trying to decipher the mystery unfolding before him. One thing was certain: the coming days would be crucial. Every move, Every word, every look could be the key to unraveling the secrets of the Thompsons, and Richard was determined to go all the way, no matter the cost. As night fell over New York City, the lights of the city blinking beyond the hotel window, Richard finally fell asleep, his dreams populated by images of rugs that unraveled to reveal dark secrets, and of Elizabeth calling out to him from a place he couldn't reach. The next day promised more revelations, more dangers, and perhaps the answers he so desperately sought. Richard knew he was walking a fine line between truth and disaster. But for Elizabeth, for their future together, he was willing to risk everything. The dawn brought with it a fine mist that hung over the streets of New York, enveloping the city in a cloak of mystery. Richard woke up before the alarm, his mind already alert and ready for another day of undercover investigation. As he prepared, once again donning the simple clothes of Charlie the driver, he mentally reviewed the previous day's events, looking for clues that might have escaped his initial perception. He arrived at the Thompson residence punctually at 7 a.m., as instructed by Ryan. The house seemed quiet, almost asleep, but Richard knew that appearances could be deceiving. He had barely parked when the front door opened, revealing not Ryan as he expected, but Anthony Thompson. The family patriarch advanced with firm steps towards the car, his face a mask of seriousness. "Good morning, Charlie," he said, his deep voice cutting through the morning air. "Today you'll be at my service. We have a long journey ahead." Richard nodded respectfully, hiding his surprise. This would be his first opportunity to observe Anthony up close, to try to understand the man Elizabeth so rarely mentioned. As he drove following Anthony's instructions, Richard noticed that they were moving away from the city center, heading towards more peripheral areas. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by occasional directions. It was after almost an hour of travel that Anthony finally spoke, his voice laden with an emotion that Richard couldn't immediately identify. "Do you have a family, Charlie?" The question caught Richard off guard. "No, sir," he answered, keeping his eyes on the road. "I'm on my own." Anthony made a low sound, something between a sigh and a grunt. "Family is everything, Charlie. It's the foundation of everything. But it can also be uncomplicated." Richard risked a quick glance through the rearview mirror, catching the distant expression in Anthony's eyes. "I imagine so, sir," he responded, cautiously. "You don't imagine," Anthony retorted, a touch of bitterness in his voice. "Sometimes to protect our family, we are forced to make choices, difficult choices." Richard's heart raced. Was Anthony about to reveal something crucial? But before he could elaborate, the older man pointed to a turn ahead. "Take a right here." They followed a dirt road, the urban landscape giving way to open fields and some sparse constructions. Finally, Anthony ordered them to stop in front of a large warehouse that seemed abandoned. "Wait in the car," Anthony ordered, quickly getting out. Richard watched as the man headed to a side door of the warehouse, where he was greeted by two rough-looking individuals. The ensuing conversation was brief and tense, with Anthony handing over an envelope and receiving another in return. When Anthony returned to the car, Richard noticed a subtle change in his posture. There was a tension in his shoulders that wasn't there before, a glimmer of worry in his eyes. "Back to the city," Anthony said dryly. During the return journey, Richard noticed that Anthony was becoming increasingly agitated. His fingers drummed nervously on the car door's armrest, and occasionally he muttered inaudible words to himself. It was when they were about to re-enter the urban area that Anthony spoke, his voice low and laden with emotion. "Do you believe in destiny, Charlie?" Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know, sir. I think our choices shape our path." Anthony let out a bitter laugh. "Choices? Yes. But what about when our past choices come back to haunt us? When fate decides to play with us, bringing back ghosts we thought we had buried?" Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Anthony's words strangely echoed Hannah's reaction upon seeing him the day before. "Sir?" he asked hesitantly. But Anthony seemed to compose himself, as if realizing he had said too much. "It's nothing, Charlie. just the ramblings of a tired old man. The rest of the trip passed in silence, but Richard's mind was buzzing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, forming an increasingly disturbing picture. Upon returning to the Thompson residence, Richard was surprised by the sight of Elizabeth hurriedly leaving the house. She seemed agitated, her eyes red, as if she had been crying. "Dad," she called out, her voice trembling. "We need to talk, it's about Mom." Anthony shot a warning look at his daughter, clearly uncomfortable with Richard's presence. "Not now, Elizabeth. We have guests arriving soon." "But Dad, she's getting worse. She keeps talking about—" "Enough!" Anthony cut her off, his voice harsh. Turning to Richard, he forced a smile. "Thank you for your services today, Charlie. You can go now. Tomorrow, report back to Ryan." Richard nodded, pretending not to notice the palpable tension between father and daughter. As he walked away, he caught fragments of the muffled argument that followed. "We can't ignore this. We've already discussed keeping it secret." "What if he finds out?" Elizabeth's last words echoed in Richard's mind as he drove away. Who was he? What exactly was happening with Hannah? And what secrets was the Thompson family so desperate to keep buried? That night, in his hotel room, Richard found himself facing a moral dilemma. Each new piece of information he uncovered only deepened the mystery, while simultaneously increasing his fear about what he might find at the end of this investigation. Looking at his phone, he saw more messages from Elizabeth, expressing concern and longing. Guilt gnawed at him. Was he doing the right thing by keeping this secret from her? Or was he just digging an ever deeper chasm between them? With a heavy sigh, Richard lay down, knowing that sleep would be elusive. Tomorrow would be another day of discoveries, another day closer to the truth. But at what cost? As the night wore on, Richard couldn't help but think that he was walking on a thin line. On one side, the truth he so desperately sought. On the other, the risk of losing everything, including the love of his life. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to mock him, reminding him that time was passing. Each second brought him closer to a revelation that could change everything. And so, amidst tumultuous thoughts and divided hearts, another day came to an end in the intricate plot involving the Thompsons. What did tomorrow hold? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The following morning dawned grey and damp, as if the sky itself reflected the atmosphere of tension that hung over Richard's investigation. He arrived at the Thompson residence with a mixture of apprehension and determination, knowing that each new day could bring the revelation he sought or the danger he feared. Ryan was waiting for him at the door, his face a mask of impatience. "Finally," he grumbled, tossing a folder onto the passenger seat. "We have a lot to do today." As Richard started the car, he couldn't help but notice Ryan's agitated state. The young man seemed more tense than usual, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, as if fearing being followed. "Where are we going, sir?" Richard asked, maintaining his submissive driver posture. "First, to the law office of Mercer and Associates," Ryan replied, his voice tense. "Then we have some special deliveries to make." The name of the office made Richard freeze for a moment. Mercer and Associates was his own company, although he rarely visited the office personally. What could Ryan want there? During the journey, Richard observed through the rearview mirror how Ryan nervously fiddled with the papers inside the folder, occasionally muttering to himself. Something was clearly troubling him. Upon arriving at the imposing building where the office was located, Ryan hurriedly got out, instructing Richard to wait. Through the glass doors, Richard saw Ryan animatedly conversing with one of the junior partners, exchanging documents and emphatic gestures. 15 minutes later, Ryan returned to the car, his face a mixture of triumph and concern. "Now to the address noted here," he said, handing Richard a piece of paper. The address led them to an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. Richard parked in front of an apparently abandoned warehouse, feeling a sense of déjà vu from the situation with Anthony the day before. "Wait here," Ryan ordered, getting out with the folder. "And no matter what happens, don't leave the car." Richard watched through the rearview mirror as Ryan disappeared inside the warehouse. The minutes dragged on, and Richard's anxiety grew with each moment. What exactly was happening in there? It was then that he heard it. A muffled scream followed by sounds of struggle. Without thinking twice, Richard got out of the car, running towards the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit, but Richard could make out three figures amid the gloom. Ryan was cornered against a wall, facing two menacing-looking men. "You don't understand," Ryan was shouting. "This will ruin everything, years of work." One of the men advanced, grabbing Ryan by the collar of his shirt. "The boss isn't happy with the latest developments. Maybe it's time for a change of leadership in the operation." It was at that moment that Richard, acting on instinct, picked up a piece of wood from the floor and hurled it towards the attackers, hitting one of them in the back. The distraction was enough. Ryan managed to break free, running towards the exit. The two men, caught by surprise, hesitated for a moment before giving chase. Richard ran back to the car, starting the engine at E. The exact moment Ryan threw himself into the passenger seat. "Drive," he shouted. "Quick!" With his heart racing, Richard floored the accelerator, leaving a cloud of dust behind. In the rearview mirror, he saw the two men emerging from the warehouse, gesticulating furiously. It was only when they were at a safe distance, back on the busy city streets, that Ryan finally spoke. His voice was a mix of anger and fear. "Who the hell are you?" Richard swallowed hard, realizing that his impulsive action had compromised his disguise. I just wanted to help, sir." Ryan studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "No ordinary driver would have done what you did. Who sent you? Are you spying on us?" "No, sir, I swear," Richard tried to defend himself, his mind working frantically to find a plausible explanation. I have a past. I've been involved in difficult situations before. When I heard the commotion, instinct took over." Ryan didn't seem entirely convinced, but the adrenaline of the moment seemed to have diminished his initial distrust. "Well, whoever you are, thank you. But this changes nothing. You didn't see or hear anything today, understood?" Richard nodded, feigning submission. "Yes, sir, of course." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Ryan made a few more stops, always quick and discreet, before finally ordering them to return to the Thompson residence. Upon arrival, Richard was surprised by the sight of Elizabeth on the porch, her face pale with worry. Seeing her brother, she ran to the car. "Ryan, thank God you're okay. She's having another episode." Ryan cursed under his breath, shooting a warning look at Richard before hurriedly getting out of the car. The siblings entered the house, leaving Richard alone with his tumultuous thoughts. That night, back in his hotel room, Richard found himself in the midst of a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. What exactly were the Thompsons involved in? What kind of operation had Ryan mentioned? And most importantly, how did all of this connect to Elizabeth and Hannah's strange behavior? Looking at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, Richard barely recognized the man staring back at him. The disguise of Charlie, the simple driver, now seemed like a thin mask, ready to shatter at any moment. Picking up his personal cell phone, he saw several unread messages from Elizabeth. Each word of concern and love was like a stab in his heart. Guilt and fear battled within him. Was he getting closer to the truth, or just sinking deeper into a well of lies and danger? With a heavy sigh, Richard threw himself onto the bed, knowing that sleep would be a luxury difficult to achieve. Tomorrow would be another day, another opportunity to unravel the mystery. But at what cost, and in the end, would the truth be worth the risk of losing everything he loved most? As the night wore on, the sounds of the city outside seemed to echo Richard's tumultuous thoughts. Every horn, every distant siren seemed a reminder of the danger lurking in the shadows. And at the center of it all was Elizabeth, his love, his beacon, and now perhaps the key to a mystery much greater than he had ever imagined. The day dawned with a fine drizzle that enveloped New York City in a gray shroud, as if the city itself was aware of the web of secrets that Richard was trying to unravel. He arrived at the Thompson residence earlier than usual, driven by a mixture of anxiety and determination. To his surprise, it was Hannah who greeted him at the door, her tired eyes somewhat unfocused. Charlie, isn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Come in, please. Ryan and Anthony left early. Urgent business, they said." Richard hesitated for a moment before following Hannah into the house. It was the first time he had been alone with her, and he couldn't help but notice how fragile, almost ethereal, the woman seemed in her silk robe. "Mrs. Thompson, is everything all right?" Richard asked, maintaining his respectful driver posture, but unable to completely hide his concern. Hannah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes gaining a glimmer of lucidity. You remind me of someone," she murmured, more to herself than to Richard. "Someone from the past, someone we lost." Richard's heart raced. Could this be the opportunity he had been waiting for? "Mom," he gently encouraged. Hannah blinked, as if coming out of a trance. "Oh, I'm sorry, sometimes my mind just wanders. Come, let's have some tea while we wait for the men to return." In the spacious and well-equipped kitchen, Hannah moved with surprising grace, preparing the tea with precise movements. Richard watched her attentively, noticing how her fingers trembled slightly as she held the cup. "You know, Charlie," Hannah began, her voice low and melancholic, "many years ago we had a great misfortune in the family. Something that changed everything." Richard leaned in slightly, his interest piqued. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mom." Hannah nodded distractedly. "It was so long ago. But the pain, it never really goes away completely. We lost someone very precious. Someone who—" She stopped, abruptly, her eyes widening as if she had said too much. At that moment, the sound of a door opening echoed through the house. Elizabeth entered the kitchen, her expression changing from surprise to concern when she saw her mother with Richard. "Mom, what's going on here?" Hannah seemed to instantly compose herself. "Ah, Elizabeth, dear, I was just keeping Charlie company while he waits for your father and brother." Elizabeth shot a distrustful look at Richard before turning to her mother. "Did you take your medication today, Mom?" Of course," Hannah responded vaguely, standing up. "I think I'll rest for a bit now." When Hannah left, Elizabeth turned to Richard, her eyes full of a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "What exactly was my mother telling you?" Richard swallowed hard, aware that he was treading on dangerous ground. "Nothing much, miss. Just casual conversation. While we had tea." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment as if trying to decipher a complex puzzle. "You seem familiar to me, you know. Are you sure we've never met before?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. Was his disguise falling apart? "No, miss. I'm sure I would remember." Before Elizabeth could press further, the sound of a car arriving interrupted the tense moment. Seconds later, Ryan burst through the kitchen door, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Elizabeth, we need to talk." "Now," he practically growled, shooting a warning look at Richard. "And you, driver, wait outside." Richard nodded submissively, but as he left, he couldn't help but notice the look of desperation Elizabeth cast in his direction. Something was about to happen, he could feel it. Outside, Richard strategically positioned himself near a partially open window, from where he could hear fragments of the heated discussion that followed. "We can't go on like this, Ryan. You don't understand. Liz, it's bigger than all of us. What if the police find out? What if—" The mention of the police made Richard's blood run cold. What exactly were the Thompsons involved in? The discussion was interrupted by Anthony's arrival. The family patriarch entered the house with heavy steps, his face a mask of concern. Minutes later, Ryan came out, his face red with anger. "Let's go," he ordered Richard. "We have places to be." During the journey, Richard noticed that Ryan seemed even more agitated than normal. His hands wouldn't stop fiddling with his cell phone, typing frantic messages. They made several stops throughout the day, each more tense than the last. At one point, Richard saw Ryan hand over a thick envelope to a man in a suit in a dark alley. At another, he observed a heated argument between Ryan and a group of men in an abandoned warehouse. With each new stop, each suspicious encounter, Richard felt he was getting closer to something big. But what? At the end of the day, when they returned to the Thompson residence, Richard noticed unusual movement. Unknown cars were parked in front of the house, and he could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains. Ryan, upon seeing the scene, cursed under his breath. "Stay here," he ordered Richard, before hurriedly getting out of the car. Richard watched tense as Ryan entered the house. Minutes passed, and then suddenly the front door burst open violently. Elizabeth came running out, tears streaming down her face. Without thinking twice, Richard got out of the car, driven by an impulse to protect the woman he loved. "Miss Elizabeth," he called out, "is everything okay?" Elizabeth stopped, looking at him with a mixture of surprise and recognition. "Richard?" she whispered, incredulous. At that moment, the world seemed to freeze. Richard's disguise had fallen, and with it, all the certainties he had about his mission, about the Thompson family, about everything. As Elizabeth stared at him, her eyes full of confusion and betrayal, Richard knew there was no going back. The secrets he sought were about to come to light, and with them the potential to destroy everything he held most dear. The sound of approaching footsteps from the door broke the moment. Richard knew he had seconds to make a decision that would change the course of everything. What would he do now? Time seemed to have frozen in that crucial instant. Richard, his disguise undone, faced Elizabeth, whose eyes reflected a storm of emotions. Shock, confusion, hurt, and perhaps most painful for Richard, a hint of betrayal. "Richard, what? How? Why?" Elizabeth's words came out broken, each syllable laden with disbelief. Before Richard could respond, the door of the house opened again. Ryan emerged, his face contorted into a mask of fury upon seeing the scene before him. "You!" he growled, advancing towards Richard. "I knew there was something wrong with you from the start." In a split second, Richard made his decision. He could no longer hide the truth, not from Elizabeth, not now. "Elizabeth, I can explain," he began, his voice trembling but determined. "I came here because I was worried about you, about the secrets your family seemed to be hiding. I just wanted to protect you, to understand what was going on." "Protect her," Ryan intervened, his voice dripping with scorn. "By lying to her? By infiltrating our family? Who the hell do you think you are?" Elizabeth, who until then had seemed paralyzed by shock, took a step forward. "Richard, you disguised yourself as a driver to spy on my family?" The pain in her voice was palpable, and Richard felt as if each word was a stab to his heart. "Yes," he admitted, knowing that honesty was his only option now. "But Elizabeth, you have to understand. There's something happening here, something big and potentially dangerous. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." At that moment, Anthony Thompson emerged from the house, his face a mask of forced calm that barely concealed the storm behind his eyes. "So," he said, his voice surprisingly controlled, "we've finally shown our true colors, haven't we, Mr. Mercer?" Richard felt a chill run down his spine. How did Anthony know his real last name? "Dad?" Elizabeth turned to Anthony, confusion evident on her face. You knew about this?" Anthony let out a heavy sigh, seeming to age decades in a matter of seconds. "Let's go inside," he finally said. "It's time we put all our cards on the table." The group entered the house in tense silence. In the living room, Hannah was waiting for them, her face pale but her eyes strangely lucid. "So the moment has finally come," she murmured, her eyes fixed on Richard. Anthony gestured for everyone to sit down. Richard noticed that, besides the Thompson family, there were two other men in the room, one of whom he recognized as the lawyer Ryan had met days before. "Richard Mercer," Anthony began, his voice laden with a mixture of resignation and something else, remorse perhaps. Or should I say, Richard Thompson. The shock of the revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He looked at Elizabeth, who seemed equally stunned. "What are you talking about, Dad?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Anthony exchanged a look with Hannah before continuing. 25 years ago, our family suffered a tragedy. Our youngest son, a baby of just 6 months, was taken from us. Richard felt the world spin around him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in a way he could never have imagined. "We searched for years," Hannah intervened, tears shining in her eyes. "We moved heaven and earth to find our boy. but he seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Until now, Anthony completed, his eyes fixed on Richard. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt as if he were in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. He, the lost son of the Thompsons, how was this possible? But how? He finally managed to articulate. How can you be sure? The lawyer stepped forward, placing a folder on the coffee table. DNA tests, he explained, conducted secretly with samples collected during your stay here. Richard felt a wave of indignation. You collected my DNA without my consent? Just as you infiltrated our family without ours, Ryan retorted. But his voice had lost some of its previous hostility. Elizabeth, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. So, Richard is my brother? Her voice was a mixture of disbelief and relief. Half-brother, technically, Anthony corrected. Richard is the son of my first marriage. He was taken before I met your mother, Hannah. The revelations continued to unfold, each more surprising than the last. Richard felt his head spinning, struggling to process everything he was hearing. But the suspicious business? The mysterious deliveries? What does all this have to do with my disappearance, he asked, trying to find some sense amid the chaos. Anthony exchanged looks with Ryan before answering. After your disappearance, we uncovered a child trafficking network operating in New York. We spent years infiltrating, trying to dismantle it from the inside out. The business you witnessed was part of that operation. We were so close to getting the final evidence, Ryan added, a touch of frustration in his voice. Your arrival complicated things. Richard felt the weight of 2 decades of secrets, famine and searching, fall upon his shoulders. He looked at Elizabeth, seeing in her the reflection of his own confusion and shock. And now? He asked, his voice laden with emotion. What happens now? Hannah stood up, approaching Richard hesitantly. Now, she said softly, it depends on you. We've found our lost son, but the question is, are you ready to find your family? The silence that followed was heavy, laden with decades of repressed emotions, revealed secrets, and an uncertain future. Richard looked around the room at the faces that, until a few days ago, were strangers and now were family. His mind was spinning with unanswered questions, with the enormity of the situation. He had come seeking answers, but the revelations he found were far greater than he could have ever imagined. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the room, Richard knew he was on the threshold of a new journey. A journey of reconciliation, understanding, and perhaps healing. The dense silence that hung in the room was almost palpable. Richard felt the weight of everyone's gazes upon him, each loaded with unspoken expectations, fears, and hopes. His mind worked frantically, trying to process the avalanche of information he had just received. Finally, it was Elizabeth who broke the silence. Her voice, though trembling, carried a surprising strength. I think we all need some time to digest this. It's a lot to absorb, all at once. Richard nodded, grateful for Elizabeth's intervention. She's right, he said, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. I came here looking for answers, but this is much bigger than I could have imagined. Anthony stood up, his rigid posture betraying the tension he felt. Richard, he began hesitant, I know we have a lot to talk about, a lot to clarify. But I want you to know that despite everything I am genuinely happy to have found you. Hannah, who had remained silent until then, took a step forward. Her eyes, previously clouded by confusion, now shone with renewed clarity. All these years we never lost hope of finding you. Even when everyone told us to move on, to accept the loss, we never gave up. Hannah's words hit Richard like waves, awakening emotions he didn't know he possessed. All his life he had wondered about his origins, about the reason he had been adopted. And now suddenly, he was face to face with a past he never knew he had. I need some air, Richard said, feeling suffocated by the intensity of the moment. Without waiting for a response, he headed to the porch, feeling the cool night air against his face like a balm for his turbulent mind. Minutes later, he heard soft footsteps approaching. It was Elizabeth. "Hey," she said softly, joining him on the porch. "How are you holding up?" Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Honestly, I don't know. It's like the ground has been pulled out from under my feet." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. "I know how you feel. Well, not exactly, but it's a lot to process." They stood in silence for a moment, observing the city lights in the distance. Finally, Richard turned to her. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry for lying, for infiltrating like this. I really thought I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting you." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment before responding. "I understand why you did it. And honestly, part of me is relieved that you did. Maybe this was how things had to happen for the truth to come out." Her words brought small comfort to Richard, but also raised new questions. "What happens now?" he asked, more to himself than to Elizabeth. "That depends on you," came a voice behind them. Ryan had joined them on the porch, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Look, Richard, I know we got off on the wrong foot, but you're my brother, our brother, and if you want, there's a place for you in this family." The sincerity in Ryan's words caught Richard by surprise. He realized that, despite all the initial hostility, there was genuine vulnerability there. I don't know if I can simply leave my life behind," Richard admitted. "But I also can't ignore what I've discovered here. You are my family." At that moment, Anthony and Hannah joined them on the porch. The small space now seemed full, not just of people, but of emotions, stories, and possibilities. "Richard," Anthony began, his voice laden with emotion, "we understand that this is a huge change for you. We don't expect you to simply fit into our lives as if the last 25 years hadn't happened. But we hope you'll give us a chance to get to know you, to be part of your life, in whatever way you feel comfortable." Hannah, with tears in her eyes, added, "And maybe we can work together to finish what we started, to ensure that no other family goes through what we went through." Their words touched something deep within Richard. He looked at each face around him. Anthony, with his eyes full of regret and hope. Hannah, with her maternal love repressed for so long. Ryan, with his protective but welcoming posture. And Elizabeth, the woman he loved, and now discovered to be his sister. In that moment, Richard understood that his life would never be the same again. But perhaps, just perhaps, this change was exactly what he had always been searching for without knowing. "I can't promise anything," he finally said, "but I'm willing to try. To get to know you, to understand this story. And if I can help prevent other families from going through this, then that's what I'll do." A collective sigh of relief went through the group. Elizabeth was the first to move, enveloping Richard in a tight hug. Soon the others joined in, and for the first time in his life, Richard found himself at the center of a true family embrace. As night fell over New York City, the Thompson family, now complete for the first time in 25 years, remained on the porch, united not just by blood ties but by a new understanding and a shared purpose. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and difficult conversations that would need to be faced. But on that night, under the stars of a city that held so many secrets, there was hope. Hope for healing, for redemption, and for a new beginning. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Richard and the entire Thompson family. The house, once a labyrinth of secrets, had now become a space of constant revelations, difficult conversations, and unexpected moments of connection. Richard decided to take a temporary leave from his business to fully dedicate himself to getting to know his biological family and understanding the details of the operation against child trafficking. He moved into a guest room in the Thompson house, a decision that initially caused discomfort but gradually proved fundamental to the process of family reconnection. On a particularly tense afternoon, Richard found himself sitting in Anthony's office, surrounded by folders, documents, and old photographs. His biological father, with deep circles under his eyes and an expression of weariness, began to unravel the complete story. "It all started on the night you were taken," Anthony began, his voice laden with emotion. "I had just gotten home from work. Your mother, your biological mother, Martha, was desperate. The nursery was empty, the window open. There were no signs of a break-in. Richard felt a lump in his throat. It was strange to hear about a mother he had never known, about a moment that had changed the course of his life without him knowing. Anthony continued, his hands trembling slightly as he leafed through an old file. The police investigated, of course, but got nowhere. It was as if you had simply evaporated. Martha couldn't bear it. She left us a few months later. Did she die? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Anthony shook his head. No, she left. She couldn't handle the pain, the uncertainty. She moved abroad, cut all ties. I never heard from her again. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with loss and regret. Richard processed this information, imagining how his life would have been if that fateful night had never happened. Is that when you started investigating on your own? He finally asked. Anthony nodded. I couldn't just give up. The more I dug, the more I realized that your disappearance wasn't an isolated case. There was a pattern, a shadowy network operating in the background. He pulled out more files, spreading them on the desk. Richard saw photos of other children, police reports, newspaper clippings, a complex web of evidence and connections that his father had built over the years. That's how I met Hannah. Anthony continued, a faint smile appearing on his tired face. She was a social worker, dealing with missing children cases. We met during the investigation and, well, one thing led to another. Richard absorbed every word, every detail. It was surreal to see his own story, a story he didn't even know existed, unfolding before him. And Ryan and Elizabeth, he asked. They grew up knowing about you, Anthony explained. We were always honest with them about having an older brother who had been taken from us. Ryan especially took it to heart. He joined our mission as soon as he was old enough. At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of his name, Ryan entered the office. His face was serious, but there was a new openness in his posture when he addressed Richard. Talking about me, Dad? He asked, a slight teasing tone in his voice. Anthony nodded. I was telling Richard about how you got involved in the investigation. Ryan sat down, his eyes fixed on Richard. It wasn't easy, you know, growing up knowing you had a brother out there somewhere, possibly needing help. It's what drove me to become a lawyer, to specialize in human trafficking cases. Richard felt a wave of admiration for his younger brother. It's incredible work you've been doing, he said sincerely. But it's not over yet, Anthony intervened, his voice gaining a tone of urgency. We're close, very close to dismantling the entire operation, but we need to act fast. It was then that Elizabeth entered the office carrying a tray of coffee. Her eyes met Richard's, and for a moment, the tension between them, born of the love they now knew to be forbidden, was almost palpable. Sorry to interrupt, she said softly. I thought you might need some caffeine. As Elizabeth served the coffee, Richard couldn't help but notice how perfectly at ease she seemed in this family scene, as if she had always been part of it. And, he realized with a mixture of sadness and acceptance, she always had been. Elizabeth, Anthony called gently. Why don't you join us? I think it's time we discuss our next step, all together. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting Richard's again before nodding and sitting down. So, Ryan began, leaning forward. What's the plan? Anthony took a deep breath before answering. We have a unique opportunity now. With Richard here, we can finally connect all the dots, but it's going to be dangerous, very dangerous. Richard felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. He looked at each face around him. His father, his brother, the woman he loved and now knew to be his sister, his family, a family for which he was willing to risk everything. I'm in, he said firmly. Whatever it takes, I'm ready. The others nodded, a new determination shining in their eyes. At that moment, united by blood ties and a common purpose, the Thompsons prepared to face their greatest challenge. Night was falling over New York City, and inside that office, plans were being drawn, strategies discussed. The final battle was about to begin, a battle to bring justice not just for Richard, but for all the families who had suffered at the hands of this criminal network. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity in the Thompson residence. Anthony's office transformed into a kind of command center, with maps, documents, and photos covering every available surface. Richard, Ryan, and Elizabeth worked tirelessly, connecting dots, analyzing information, and devising strategies. Hannah, for her part, assumed a crucial role, utilizing her contacts in social services to obtain valuable information about suspicious cases of irregular adoption over the years. Her calm and determined presence served as an anchor for the entire family during moments of tension. On a particularly intense afternoon, while everyone was gathered in the office, Ryan finally presented the plan they had developed. "We have reason to believe that the center of operations for the trafficking network is located in a warehouse complex in the port area," he began, pointing to a map spread out on the table. "Our sources indicate that a large transaction is scheduled to take place in 3 days." Anthony nodded gravely. "This may be our only chance to catch all those involved at once." Richard, who had thrown himself headlong into the investigation, feeling it was his obligation to make up for the lost years, leaned over the map. "And how exactly do we plan to intercept this operation?" It was Elizabeth who answered, her voice firm and determined. "Infiltration. We need someone on the inside to confirm the details and ensure we have concrete evidence before calling the authorities." A tense silence fell over the room. The implication was clear. Someone would have to take the risk, entering the Lions. "Then I'll do it," Richard offered without hesitation. "No!" Anthony and Hannah exclaimed in unison, fear evident in their voices. Ryan shook his head. "It can't be you, Richard. They might recognize you. Remember, you were one of their victims." "Then I'll go," Elizabeth declared, her voice leaving no room for argument. Richard felt his heart tighten. The idea of Elizabeth putting herself in danger was almost unbearable. "Elizabeth, no, it's too risky." She faced him, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and defiance. "That's exactly why it has to be me. I'm the only one they've never seen, the only one who can enter without raising suspicions." A heated debate followed, with each family member presenting arguments for and against the plan. In the end, it became clear that Elizabeth was right. She was the logical choice for the mission. With heavy hearts, but aware of the importance of the operation, the family began to prepare Elizabeth for her dangerous task. Ryan used his contacts to create a convincing false identity. Anthony and Hannah worked on a cover story that would allow Elizabeth to approach the traffickers without raising suspicions. Richard, in turn, spent hours training Elizabeth in observation and information-gathering techniques he had learned throughout his business career. The long nights of preparation brought the two closer, but also made painfully clear what they had lost. On the eve of the operation, Richard found Elizabeth alone on the porch, looking thoughtfully at the illuminated city. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly, joining her. Elizabeth turned to him, a sad smile on her lips. "Honestly, I'm terrified, but I also know it's something I need to do. For you, for all the other children who went through what you went through." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "I wish I could go in your place." "I know," she replied, gently placing her hand on his arm. "But this is my chance to make a difference, to be part of the solution." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Richard spoke. "Elizabeth, about us." She gently interrupted him. "I know, Richard, I feel it too. But now, more than ever, we need to focus on what's really important." Richard nodded, understanding what she meant. The love they felt for each other, though real and deep, had to be set aside for a greater good. "Promise me you'll be careful," he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "I promise," she replied, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that said more than words could express. The next morning, the Thompson family gathered for a tense and silent breakfast. Each was immersed in their own thoughts, aware of the risks and what was at stake. When it was time for Elizabeth to leave, there were tight hugs and whispered words of encouragement. Hannah fastened a small crucifix around her daughter's neck, silent tears running down her face. Richard was the last to say goodbye. He held Elizabeth's hands in his, looking deep into her eyes. "Remember the plan. At the slightest sign of danger, you get out of there. Understood? Elizabeth nodded, forcing a brave smile. Understood. Don't worry, I'll be back before you know it. And with that she departed, leaving behind a family united by hope and fear. As Elizabeth's car disappeared in the distance, Richard felt the weight of waiting settle over them. The next few hours would be crucial, not just for the success of the operation, but for the future of the entire Thompson family. The final battle was about to begin, and all they could do now was wait, hope, and pray that Elizabeth would return, safely bringing with her the keys to dismantling once and for all the network that had caused so much pain and suffering. The hours that followed Elizabeth's departure were the longest and most agonizing that the Thompson family had ever experienced. Anthony's office, previously a center of frantic activity, was now immersed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional clinking of coffee cups and the muffled sound of restless footsteps. Richard couldn't stay still. He alternated between pacing back and forth and being glued to the radio, anxiously waiting for any communication from Elizabeth. Ryan sat rigidly in front of a laptop, monitoring the security cameras they had managed to hack near the warehouse complex. Anthony and Hannah remained together, their hands intertwined as if seeking strength from each other. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the radio crackled to life. "I'm inside," came Elizabeth's low, tense voice. "The movement here is intense. Looks like they're preparing for something big." Richard felt his heart leap. Hearing Elizabeth's voice brought both relief and a new wave of concern. "Can you see anything specific?" Ryan asked, leaning over the radio. There are children here," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "At least a dozen of them. They're scared, Richard. They remind me of you when you were little." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The reality of what they were facing hit him with full force. These weren't just files and old photos. They were real lives, innocent children trapped in the same nightmare he had lived through. "Stay calm, Elizabeth," Anthony instructed, his voice firm despite the evident emotion. "Keep observing and collecting evidence. Remember, we need concrete proof before we can act." The following hours were an emotional roller coaster. Elizabeth reported periodically what she saw, each new piece of information adding to the dark puzzle they were piecing together. It was in the middle of the afternoon that things began to intensify. "Something's happening," Elizabeth murmured, urgently over the radio. "There's movement. Looks like they're preparing to transfer the children." Richard exchanged alarmed looks with Ryan. It was now or never. "Elizabeth," Ryan spoke quickly, "we need visual confirmation. If you can, try to take some discrete photos." "Understood," she replied. The minutes that followed were pure agony. The silence on the radio seemed to stretch indefinitely. Richard could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each second of silence increasing his fear that something had gone wrong. Suddenly, Elizabeth's voice cut through the air, urgent and frightened. "Damn. I think I've been seen. Someone's coming. Towards me. The transmission was abruptly cut off. "Elizabeth," Richard shouted into the radio. "Elizabeth, answer." Silence. Panic set in the room. Hannah stifled a sob. Anthony turned pale as a ghost. "We have to do something," Richard exclaimed, already moving towards the door. Ryan held him by the arm. "Wait, we can't just barge in there. We could put Elizabeth and the other children in even greater danger." "Then what do you suggest we do?" Richard retorted, frustration evident in his voice. "Just stand here while Elizabeth could be—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The mere thought of something happening to Elizabeth was unbearable. It was at that moment that Anthony's phone rang. Everyone froze, looking at the device as if it were a bomb about to explode. With trembling hands, Anthony answered, putting it on speakerphone. "Mr. Thompson," came a cold, calculating voice from the other end of the line. "It seems we have something that belongs to you, or rather, someone." Richard's blood ran cold. They had Elizabeth. "Who are you? What do you want?" Anthony demanded, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. The laugh that came in response was devoid of any humor. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is that your little spying operation ends here. You have 1 hour to come to warehouse 17. Come alone, or your precious daughter will pay the price. The call ended, leaving a deafening silence in the room. For a moment, no one moved, all processing what had just happened. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, everyone started talking at once. We can't give in to their demands, Ryan argued. But we can't abandon Elizabeth. Hannah cried. There must be another way, Richard muttered, his mind racing through all the possibilities. Anthony raised his hands, calling for silence. When he spoke, his voice was grave and determined. I'm going. We have no choice. Dad? No, Richard and Ryan protested in unison, but Anthony was adamant. Listen, all of you. I've spent my entire life trying to fix the mistake that cost Richard his childhood. I'm not going to lose Elizabeth too. I'll meet them, and while I do, you alert the authorities. It's our best chance. The plan was risky, dangerous, but it was the only one they had. As Anthony prepared to leave, Richard pulled him aside. Dad, he said, the words still strange in his mouth, be careful and bring Elizabeth back to us. Anthony nodded, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. I will, that's a promise. As they watched Anthony depart, Richard felt a fierce determination grow inside him. No matter what happened, he wouldn't lose his newly discovered family. Not now, not after everything they had been through. The final battle was about to begin, and the Thompsons were ready to face it together, united by love, courage, and the hope of a future free from the shadows of the past. Time seemed to crawl as Richard, Ryan, and Hannah anxiously awaited news. Ryan had activated his contacts in the police, organizing a tactical operation to intervene at the right moment. Richard, unable to stay put, insisted on going to the location, promising to stay hidden and only observe. I need to be there, he argued, his voice trembling with emotion. I can't sit here while Elizabeth and our father are in danger. Reluctantly, Ryan agreed, on the condition that Richard strictly follow his instructions. The two brothers departed, leaving Hannah at home to coordinate communication with the authorities. As they approached the warehouse complex, the tension was palpable. Richard could feel his heart beating furiously against his chest. They parked at a safe distance, using binoculars to observe the movement. Warehouse 17 seemed quiet, but Richard noticed suspicious movements in the shadows. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, their attentive gazes sweeping the area. There, Ryan whispered, pointing to an approaching car. It was Anthony. Richard watched with his heart in his throat as his father got out of the vehicle, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Two burly men emerged from the shadows, flanking Anthony and leading him into the warehouse. Damn, Ryan muttered. Now we have to wait for the police signal to act. The minutes that followed were agony. Richard felt helpless, knowing that his family was in danger just a few hundred meters away. Suddenly, a sound of breaking glass echoed through the air, followed by shouts and the unmistakable sound of gunshots. No, Richard shouted, already moving towards the warehouse before Ryan could stop him. Richard, wait, Ryan called, running after his brother. But Richard couldn't wait. Driven by fear and adrenaline, he ran towards the warehouse, dodging shadows and praying not to be seen. As he approached the side entrance, he heard more shouts and the sound of a struggle. Without thinking twice, he pushed the door and entered. The scene that greeted him was chaotic. Anthony was engaged in a physical struggle with one of the henchmen, while Elizabeth, with her hands tied, was trying to free herself. Several children were huddled in a corner, crying and screaming in fear. Richard acted on instinct. He grabbed a metal bar nearby and hurled it at the man fighting Anthony, hitting him in the head and knocking him down. Richard! Elizabeth shouted, her eyes widening in surprise and relief. He ran to her, quickly untying her hands. Are you okay? He asked, examining her for injuries. I am, she replied, breathless. But we have to get these children out of here. At you. That moment, Ryan burst through the door, followed closely by a tactical police team. The sound of sirens filled the air, indicating that reinforcements were on the way. Police, everyone on the ground, shouted the team leader. Chaos intensified. Shots were exchanged, screams echoed through the warehouse. Richard pulled Elizabeth behind a pile of boxes, shielding her with his body. "The children!" Elizabeth shouted, pointing to the terrified group in the corner. Richard nodded, understanding immediately. Together they moved quickly, crouched towards the children. With soft words and gentle gestures, they began to guide them to a safer location. The battle continued around them. Richard saw Anthony and Ryan working side by side with the police, subduing the criminals. It was a surreal moment. His family reunited, fighting not just for themselves, but for all the other families who had suffered at the hands of these traffickers. Gradually, the sounds of fighting diminished. The criminals were overpowered and handcuffed. The children, still scared but safe, were gathered to be taken to a secure location. When silence finally fell over the warehouse, Richard looked around, hardly believing it was all over. Elizabeth was by his side, trembling slightly, but with a look of determination in her eyes. Anthony and Ryan approached, both battered but alive. "It's over," Anthony said softly, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. "It's finally over." The tears that Richard had been holding back for so long finally came. He hugged his father, feeling the weight of decades of pain and separation dissolving in that moment. Elizabeth joined the hug, followed by Ryan. There, in the midst of chaos and destruction, the Thompson family was reunited, stronger and more united than ever. As sirens continued to sound outside, and police officers began the work of processing the scene and caring for the rescued children, Richard knew that a new journey was just beginning. A journey of healing, reconciliation, and building a future together. Looking at his family, at Elizabeth, the sister he had almost loved in a different way, Richard felt a wave of gratitude and hope. They had faced the worst and emerged victorious. Now it was time to start rebuilding, not just their own lives, but the lives of all the families who had been affected by this criminal network. The nightmare had ended, but the dawn of a new era was just beginning for the Thompsons. The weeks that followed the dramatic rescue at the warehouse were a whirlwind of emotions and activities for the Thompson family. The operation had been a resounding success, resulting not only in the rescue of the children, but also in the apprehension of key figures in the trafficking network. The media was in an uproar, with headlines proclaiming the dismantling of one of the country's largest criminal organizations. For Richard, it was as if he were living in a dream. After years of seeking answers about his past, he had not only found his biological family, but also actively participated in solving the mystery that had shaped his entire life. The Thompson house, once a place of secrets and tension, now pulsed with renewed energy. Hannah, freed from the weight of the past, flourished, her mind clearer than it had been in years. Anthony, though still dealing with the emotional scars of decades of searching, seemed lighter, as if a great burden had been removed from his shoulders. Ryan dove headfirst into legal work, coordinating with authorities to ensure that all those involved in the trafficking network were properly prosecuted. His determination was fierce, fueled by the desire for justice not just for his family, but for all victims. And Elizabeth was a constant source of strength and compassion. Despite the trauma of her kidnapping, she dedicated herself tirelessly to helping the rescued children and their families. Richard watched her with a mixture of admiration and a love that, though transformed, remained deep and unshakable. One afternoon, about a month after the incident, the family gathered on the porch of the house. The sun was setting over New York City, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Richard looked at the faces around him, his family, reunited after so many years of separation and pain. "You know," he began, his voice soft but laden with emotion. "For a long time I wondered why things happened the way they did, why I was separated from you, why I spent so many years not knowing who I really was." Anthony placed a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder. "Son, sometimes life takes us down paths we don't understand at the moment." "But now," Elizabeth intervened, a soft smile on her lips, "look where those paths have brought us. Together, finally." Richard nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "It's true, and not just that. Think of all the lives we've changed, all the families we've helped reunite." Ryan, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. "And our work is far from over. There are so many other children out there, so many other families that still need help." Hannah, her eyes shining with a clarity that had been absent for so long, smiled. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll continue our work, but now as a united family." The conversation flowed naturally to the future. Plans were discussed to expand the reach of their organization, to work more closely with authorities and other NGOs dedicated to child protection. Richard, feeling the weight of his experience and the desire to make a difference, proposed using his resources and connections in the business world to support the cause. "We can create a foundation," he suggested, dedicated not just to rescuing children, but to providing long-term support for them and their families. The idea was met with enthusiasm. Elizabeth, with her background in architecture, talked about designing safe and welcoming spaces for rescued children. Ryan mentioned the possibility of offering free legal assistance to affected families. As the night progressed, the conversation became more personal. Laughter was shared over childhood memories. Stories were exchanged, filling in the gaps of lost years. In a quiet moment, Richard found himself alone with Elizabeth on the porch. The air between them was charged with unspoken emotions. "Elizabeth," he began hesitantly, "I want you to know what I feel for you, though different now, is no less profound." She smiled, her eyes shining with understanding. "I know, Richard. What we have now, this connection as siblings, is something precious, something I'll cherish for the rest of my life." They hugged, an embrace that spoke of love, of loss, but also of a new beginning. When the family gathered again for dinner, there was a palpable feeling of hope and purpose in the air. They had faced the worst that fate could throw at them and emerged stronger, more united. Richard looked around the table at the faces of his family, not just by blood, but chosen and forged through the trials they had faced together. He felt overwhelmed by a sense of belonging, of being exactly where he was meant to be. The future, though still uncertain, seemed bright with possibilities. The Thompsons had transformed their personal tragedy into a call to make a difference in the world. And together, they were ready to face any challenge that came their way. As night fell over New York City, the Thompson house shone with light and life, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed dark. And at the center of it all was Richard, the lost and found son, finally home. The months that followed brought significant changes not only for the Thompson family, but for the entire community around them. The Thompson Foundation, envisioned by Richard and enthusiastically supported by the whole family, quickly took shape. The foundation's first project was the creation of a shelter center for children rescued from trafficking and abuse situations. Elizabeth led the architectural project, creating a space that was both safe and welcoming, with green areas, therapy rooms, and educational spaces. Richard used his business skills to secure funding and strategic partnerships. His reputation in the business world, combined with the family's moving story, opened many doors. Companies and philanthropists from across the country mobilized to support the cause. Ryan, in turn, assembled a legal team dedicated to offering free assistance to families affected by child trafficking. His tireless work not only helped prosecute criminals, but also navigate the complex processes of family reunification and psychological support. Anthony and Hannah, though officially retired, were the emotional heart of the foundation. Their personal experiences made them invaluable counselors for other families going through similar situations. One day, about 6 months after the shelter center's inauguration, Richard was making a routine visit when he noticed a boy sitting alone in a corner of the courtyard. Something about the child's solitary posture deeply touched him. Approaching gently, Richard sat down next to the boy. "Hello," he said softly. "My name is Richard. What's yours?" The boy looked up, his eyes large and frightened. "Michael," he answered in a low voice. "It's nice to meet you, Michael," Richard smiled. "Do you like it here?" Michael shrugged, looking around the courtyard. "It's okay, better than before, but I miss my family." Richard's heart tightened. He knew that feeling of loss and loneliness well. I understand, Michael. Did you know that I was also separated from my family when I was little? The boy's eyes widened with interest. Really? And did you find them? Richard nodded, a soft smile on his lips. Yes, after many years. And you know what? It was difficult, but it made me who I am today. And now I can help other children like you. As they talked, Richard saw a glimmer of hope appear in Michael's eyes. It was a powerful reminder of why they did this work. That night, during the family dinner, Richard shared his experience with Michael. Seeing him reminded me of myself, he said, emotion in his voice. It made me realize how far we've come, but also how much we still have to do. Elizabeth reached for Richard's hand, squeezing it gently. Every child we help is a victory, Richard. A family rebuilt, a life transformed. And not just their lives, Ryan added. Look at us. Who would have thought a year ago that we'd all be here doing this work together? Hannah smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It's true. In a way, every child we help is a chance to correct what happened to our own family. Anthony raised his glass in a toast. To the Thompson family and to all the families we're still going to help reunite. As everyone raised their glasses, Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He looked around the table, at the faces of his family, people who not long ago were strangers, and now were the most important part of his life. In the days and weeks that followed, the foundation continued to grow and expand its reach. New partnerships were formed, new projects initiated. Richard often found himself thinking of Michael and all the other children whose lives were being transformed. 1 year after the dramatic rescue at the warehouse, the Thompson family organized a large celebration at the shelter center. Reunited. Families, rescued children, volunteers, and supporters all gathered to celebrate the progress made and renew their commitment to the cause. During the event, Richard took the stage to give a speech. Looking at the crowd, he saw smiling faces, eyes bright with hope. He saw Michael, now reunited with his family, waving enthusiastically. He saw his own family, Elizabeth, Ryan, Anthony, and Hannah, smiling with pride. A year ago, he began, his voice laden with emotion, I was a man in search of answers. Today I stand before you not just as someone who found his family, but as part of a much larger family. A family that extends to every rescued child, every reunited family, every life transformed. As Richard continued his speech, talking about hope, perseverance, and the power of family love, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The path that had led him here had been long and often painful, but every step had been worth it. The night ended with a beautiful performance by a choir formed of children from the center. As their voices rose in harmony, singing about hope and new beginnings, Richard looked around and saw tears in the eyes of many. Tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude. In that moment, surrounded by his family and by all the lives they had touched, Richard knew with certainty this was just the beginning. The legacy of the Thompsons, born from pain and separation, had transformed into a powerful force for good. And together, they would continue to make a difference, one day at a time, one family at a time. As the last notes of the song echoed through the air, Richard felt a deep peace settle in his heart. He was home, not just with his blood family, but with a much larger family. A family united by love, hope, and the determination to create a better world for all children. 2 years passed since the night of the celebration at the shelter center. The Thompson Foundation had become a nationally recognized force in the fight against child trafficking and family reunification. Richard, along with Elizabeth, Ryan, Anthony, and Hannah, continued to lead the efforts with unwavering passion and dedication. On a sunny spring morning, Richard was in his office at the foundation when he received an unexpected call. It was Michael, the boy he had met at the shelter center 2 years ago. Mr. Richard, the teenager's voice sounded hesitant over the phone. I needed to talk to you. Richard smiled, remembering the shy boy he had met. Michael, it's good to hear your voice. How can I help? There was a pause before Michael continued. I wanted to thank you for everything you and your family did for me and so many others, and I wanted to ask a favor." Intrigued, Richard listened as Michael explained that he wanted to volunteer at the foundation. He had ideas for a mentoring program, where teenagers who had been through the center could help newly rescued children. "It's a brilliant idea, Michael," Richard responded, feeling a wave of pride. "Why don't you come over here so we can talk more about it?" After hanging up the phone, Richard reflected on how a simple conversation 2 years ago had planted a seed that was now blossoming in unexpected ways. He shared the news with Elizabeth, who was working in a nearby room. "That's wonderful," Elizabeth exclaimed, her eyes shining. "It's exactly the kind of initiative we need, the children themselves becoming agents of change." As they discussed the possibilities of Michael's program, Ryan entered the office, his face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You won't believe what I just discovered," he said, placing a folder on the desk. "Remember that old case we were investigating? About other children who might have been trafficked at the same time as Richard?" Richard and Elizabeth nodded, suddenly serious. "Well," Ryan continued, "we found a lead. A woman contacted us, claiming to have information about a network of illegal adoptions that had been operating for decades." Richard's heart raced. Even after all this time, after all the victories and progress, the past still had the power to deeply affect him. "What exactly does she know?" asked Elizabeth, leaning forward with interest. Ryan sighed. "She claims to have worked as a nurse in a clinic that served as a front for the scheme. Says she can identify dozens of children who were illegally separated from their biological families." The silence that followed was heavy with the implications of this revelation. Richard felt a mixture of emotions: hope for the possibility of helping more families, apprehension about what they might discover, and a pang of pain as he remembered his own journey. "We need to investigate this thoroughly," he finally said, "but carefully. We can't give false hope to families." Elizabeth nodded, placing a comforting hand on Richard's arm. "We'll do this together as we've always done." In the weeks that followed, the Thompson family dove headfirst into this new investigation. Meanwhile, Michael's mentoring program began to take shape, bringing new energy and perspective to the foundation's work. A month later, the family gathered for dinner at Anthony and Hannah's house. The table was full, not just with the immediate family, but also with Michael and some other young people who had joined the mentoring program. As they shared the meal, conversations flowed naturally between personal and professional topics. Richard observed amazed how his family had expanded and evolved over the years. In a moment of pause, Anthony raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "To our family, which has grown in ways we could never have imagined, and to all the families we're still going to help." Everyone raised their glasses, echoing the sentiment. Richard looked around the table, his heart full of gratitude. He saw Hannah's proud smile, the determination in Ryan's eyes, the glow of compassion on Elizabeth's face, and the youthful enthusiasm of Michael and his friends. At that moment, Richard realized that his journey was far from over. Each new day brought challenges but also opportunities to make a difference. The past, with all its pains and secrets, had become the foundation on which they built a better future for countless families. As the night progressed, filled with laughter, stories, and plans for the future, Richard felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. The path that had brought him here had been long and often painful, but each step had led him exactly where he needed to be. The Thompson family, once fragmented by fate, was now at the center of a network of hope and transformation that extended far beyond its original boundaries. And Richard knew with unwavering certainty that together they would continue to weave this web of love, healing, and redemption for many years to come.